Today I have a really amazing feature for you on Behind the Billions. We're examining the story of an individual who is truly remarkable and currently ranks among the world's wealthiest people.
Oh my God, Steve Ballmer. I'm so excited to talk about him today. Like, this guy is just, he's absolutely incredible. From being Microsoft's CEO for 14 years to now owning the LA Clippers, he's had such an amazing journey.
Yeah, and what's crazy is that he's worth something like 150 billion according to recent estimates. That's that's just mind-blowing to me.
I know, right? And and what I find really fascinating about Ballmer is that he wasn't the founder of Microsoft. That was Bill Gates. But he joined really early as like the 30th employee. And then, well, he basically helped build it into this absolute tech giant that we all know today. And now he's, this larger than life sports team owner who's literally jumping around courtside at Clippers games.
He's definitely not your typical billionaire, is he? I mean, the energy this guy has is something else.
Totally. And that's exactly why I think his story deserves a deep dive on Behind the Billions. There's just so much to unpack with Ballmer, from his relationship with Gates to those like viral videos of him going absolutely crazy on stage shouting developers, developers, developers.
So let's talk about where Steve Ballmer actually came from. He was born in Detroit, Michigan back in 1956, right? And I'm curious, like, what was his childhood like that eventually led him to become this tech titan?
Yeah, so Ballmer grew up in this pretty affluent community called Farmington Hills in Michigan. His dad was actually, a manager at Ford Motor Company who'd emigrated from Switzerland back in 1948. And and interestingly, through his mom's side, he's actually a second cousin of Gilda Radner, the famous comedian from Saturday Night Live,
Oh, wow. I had no idea there was a comedy connection there. That's pretty cool.
right? But what's really remarkable about young Steve was just how incredibly smart he was. Like, this guy scored a 790 out of 800 on the math section of his SATs, which is it's just ridiculous. And he was the valedictorian of his high school, Detroit Country Day School, which is this fancy prep school.
So he was basically a math genius from the start?
Absolutely. And get this, when he got to Harvard, he actually scored higher than Bill Gates in this really prestigious math competition. Like, we're talking about two absolute prodigies here. And Ballmer actually outperformed Gates mathematically, which is it's mind-blowing, right?
And they actually lived near each other at Harvard, didn't they?
Yeah, they literally lived down the hall from each other as sophomores. And Ballmer was, doing all these impressive things. He managed the Harvard football team, worked on the school newspaper, and then graduated magna cum laude with a degree in applied mathematics and economics. He was the first person in his family to graduate from college, which I think is it's really impressive.
So what did he do right after Harvard? Did he, go straight to Microsoft?
No, actually. He first went to work at Procter& Gamble for 2 years as an assistant product manager where, and this is pretty wild, he shared an office with Jeff Immelt, who later became the CEO of General Electric. Then he actually tried his hand at screenwriting in Hollywood for a bit, if you can believe that. But it didn't work out. So he headed to Stanford for his MBA. And that's where he dropped out in 1980 to join Microsoft when his old hallmate Bill Gates came calling.
Wait, he just dropped out of Stanford? That's a pretty big decision.
Totally. But I mean, it obviously worked out pretty well for him in the end, don't you think?
So I'm really curious about how Ballmer actually ended up at Microsoft. I mean, dropping out of Stanford is a huge decision, right? What was the story there?
Oh, this is such a pivotal moment in tech history. So basically, on June 11, 1980, Ballmer joins Microsoft as their 30th employee and becomes their first ever business manager. Gates needed someone to help run the business side of things because, well, Gates was this brilliant programmer, but needed someone with actual business know-how.
And what was the deal they offered him? Like, was it a typical salary package or something different?
No, not at all typical. So when Ballmer joined, they gave him a salary of $50,000, which, was decent money back then, plus 10% of whatever profit he generated for the company. But there was no equity initially, which is it's crazy to think about now.
Wait, seriously? No equity?
Right? But here's where it gets interesting. As Microsoft grew, that profit sharing arrangement was actually ballooning out of control. It was becoming this massive liability for the company. So when they decided to reorganize Microsoft as an actual corporation instead of a partnership, they needed to fix this situation.
So what happened then?
Well, this guy, Dave Marquardt, suggested that Ballmer should get 8% ownership of the entire company in exchange for canceling that profit sharing model. Paul Allen, Gates's co-founder, was not totally on board at first, but Gates actually agreed to personally fund the majority of Ballmer's stake. That's how much Gates valued him. So when Microsoft incorporated in 1981, Ballmer owned 8% of what would become like one of the most valuable companies on the planet.
That's an incredible deal in retrospect. What did he, actually do at Microsoft in those early days?
So Ballmer was he was this force of nature at Microsoft from day one. In his first 20 years, he headed up all these different divisions, operations, OS development, sales, support, you name it. By 1992, he became executive VP for sales and support, and he was absolutely crushing it.
That's a pretty rapid rise, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And and what's fascinating is that he was really instrumental in developing the Net framework, which was this huge deal for Microsoft's developer strategy. Then in July 1998, he gets promoted to president, making him basically the number 2 person at the company after Gates. This guy who started as employee number 30 was now running huge chunks of what had become the most dominant tech company in the world.
So he was basically being groomed to take over from Gates at that point?
Exactly. And that promotion to president was it was the final step before the big job. Just a year and a half later, in January 2000, Ballmer officially became CEO of Microsoft. It was this incredible journey from being the first business hire to running the whole show in just 20 years. And, that 8% stake in Microsoft, that decision to drop out of Stanford for his friend Bill's little computer company, that would eventually make him one of the richest people on the planet.
So, Emma, when Ballmer actually took over as CEO in 2000, what was he walking into? Like, was Microsoft in a good place at that point?
So that's actually super interesting because, when Ballmer officially became CEO on January 13th, 2000, he was walking into this like absolute minefield. Microsoft was in the middle of this massive antitrust lawsuit brought by the US government and 20 states, plus all these class action lawsuits and complaints from competitors. It was a mess, honestly.
That doesn't sound like the best time to take over a company.
Right? Talk about a tough first day. And here's what's really telling about the difference between Gates and Ballmer. Gates wanted to keep fighting these lawsuits, but Ballmer, he took a completely different approach. He was like, being the object of a complaint from your government it's this awkward, uncomfortable position with all downside. He actually said, people assume if the government brought a complaint, there's really a problem. And your ability to say we're a good, proper, moral place is tough. So he wanted to settle these things and move on.
What about his management style? How did that differ from Gates?
Oh my God, it was like night and day. Ballmer was much more focused on like the business fundamentals. When he took over, he started requiring detailed business justification to approve new products. Gates would let hundreds of potentially interesting or trendy projects flourish, but Ballmer was like, no, show me how this makes business sense.
That's a pretty big culture shift.
Totally. And in 2005, he made this really significant move by recruiting B. Kevin Turner from Walmart. Turner had been running Sam's Club as president and CEO, and Ballmer brought him in to be Microsoft's chief operating officer. The goal was to, instill more process and discipline in Microsoft's operations and sales teams, which were kind of all over the place before that.
So what happened when Gates stepped back completely?
That's when things got really interesting. After Gates retired from day-to-day activities, Ballmer oversaw this dramatic shift away from the company's PC-first heritage. He replaced most major division heads to break down what Businessweek called these talent-hoarding fiefdoms within Microsoft.
That sounds like a pretty massive reorganization.
It absolutely was. And by 2012, Businessweek was actually saying Microsoft arguably had the best product lineup in its history. Ballmer was driving this connected computing strategy and making big moves like acquiring Skype. He was really trying to transform the company from this PC software giant into something more diverse and forward-looking.
Did he handle the transition well?
Well, that's where opinions start to differ. On one hand, he was making these bold structural changes, but on the other hand, Microsoft was starting to face these existential challenges from mobile and cloud computing that would really test Ballmer's leadership. And that's where some of his biggest struggles would eventually come from.
So, Emma, when we look at the actual business results under Ballmer's leadership, what's the bottom line? Like, did Microsoft actually make money during his 14 years as CEO?
Oh my God, yes. That's actually the thing that people sometimes miss about Ballmer. The financial results were honestly incredible. Under his watch, Microsoft tripled its annual revenue from like $25 billion to $70 billion. And the net income, it increased by 215% to $23 billion. I mean, that's massive growth.
Those numbers sound impressive, but how did Microsoft's stock perform during that time?
Well, that's where things get complicated. The stock price basically stagnated during his tenure. which is why some investors were so critical. But if you look at the actual business fundamentals, Microsoft's gross profit was like 75 cents on every dollar in sales, which was double that of Google or IBM at the time. His total annual profit growth was around 16.4%, which actually beat legendary CEOs like Jack Welch at GE and Lou Gerstner at IBM.
Where were those profits coming from, though? Was it just riding the wave of Windows and Office?
That's a fair question. And look, a lot of it was from Windows and Office, right? He maintained their profitability and successfully fought off threats from competitors like Linux and other open source operating systems, and Google Docs was starting to emerge too. But what doesn't get enough credit is that he actually built half a dozen new businesses from scratch.
Like what? What were some of those new businesses?
So the big ones were the data centers division and the Xbox Entertainment and Devices division, which grew to almost $9 billion. And Xbox is such an interesting case, you know? Microsoft was nowhere in gaming, and now they're one of the big three console makers. But his most impressive achievement was probably building Microsoft's $20 billion enterprise business.
What exactly was that enterprise business?
So it was all these products like Exchange, Windows Server, SQL Server, SharePoint, System Center, and Dynamics CRM. And what's fascinating is that each of these initially faced like an uphill battle for acceptance, but they eventually emerged as either leading or dominant in their categories. This diversification was crucial because it helped offset Microsoft's reliance on PCs as we entered what people call the post-PC era.
But there must have been some serious criticisms too, right?
Oh, for sure. The biggest criticism, and it's a valid one, was that Ballmer completely missed several new consumer technologies. Microsoft had to play catch-up in tablets, smartphones, and music players, and the results were, well, they were mixed at best.
Wasn't Microsoft actually early on some of that stuff, though?
That's the most frustrating part. According to the Wall Street Journal, Microsoft actually latched on to technologies like smartphones, touchscreens, smart cars, and even wearables long before Apple or Google. But, and this is the critical failure, they repeatedly killed promising projects if they threatened the Windows and Office cash cows. It was like they could see the future but were too afraid to embrace it. That's why the BBC even named him one of the worst CEOs of 2013.
Ouch, that's harsh.
Yeah, it is, but the financial numbers alone tell only part of the story. The legacy of missing those massive consumer technology shifts, that's the complicated part of evaluating Ballmer's tenure. Strong financial performance, but some really big strategic misses.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the mobile revolution. This seems to be where Ballmer really stumbled, right?
Oh my God, yes. This is like the biggest misstep of his entire career and probably what he regrets the most. I mean, in 2007, when Apple unveiled the iPhone, Ballmer famously said, "There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance." And that quote has just, followed him around ever since.
Wow, talk about a bad prediction.
Right? And the thing is, Microsoft actually had a head start in mobile. They had Windows Mobile in the early 2000s, and Ballmer himself later admitted that his lack of focus on mobile during that period was a huge regret. By the time the iPhone took off, Microsoft was already stuck as a distant third in the smartphone market.
What was his reasoning behind dismissing the iPhone so quickly?
So he basically thought the price point was ridiculous. He couldn't imagine people paying $600 or $700 for a phone. But what he completely missed was Apple's business model innovation of getting carriers to subsidize the phones as part of the monthly bill. In fact, he later said, and I'm quoting, "People like to point to this quote where I said iPhones will never sell because the price was too high." And there was a business model innovation by Apple to get it essentially built into the monthly cell phone bill.
So he eventually recognized his mistake?
Yeah, but by then it was way too late. Microsoft tried to catch up with Windows Phone, which was actually a really good product with an innovative interface, but they were just so far behind. And then in 2013, Ballmer made what he called his toughest decision, acquiring Nokia's mobile phone division in this desperate attempt to get back in the game.
How much did that decision cost Microsoft?
Well, Microsoft bought Nokia for over $7 billion, and then they ended up writing off pretty much the entire acquisition just a few years later. It was a complete disaster. This is exactly the kind of thing that made investors so frustrated with Ballmer. Microsoft had the talent and the resources to dominate mobile, but they completely missed the boat.
And how did this affect Microsoft's position in the market?
It was devastating for their consumer strategy. Look, when smartphones became the primary computing device for billions of people, Microsoft was nowhere to be found. Apple and Google completely dominated with iOS and Android. And this meant that Microsoft lost the platform war for an entire generation of computing.
That sounds like it had huge implications.
Absolutely massive. It's not just about the phone itself, it's about the ecosystem, the app stores, the developers, the adjacent markets. By missing mobile, Microsoft essentially handed over control of the future of computing to its competitors. And that's going to be a permanent part of Ballmer's legacy, despite all the financial success we talked about earlier. It's why when Satya Nadella took over, his first big move was basically abandoning the Nokia acquisition and pivoting the company toward cloud services instead.
So we've talked about Ballmer's business decisions, but I'm really curious about what was he actually like as a person? Because I've heard he had quite the personality.
Oh my God, yes. Steve Ballmer is like probably one of the most energetic, enthusiastic, and honestly just wild tech executives ever. The complete opposite of what you'd expect from a stereotypical CEO. And, it's funny because apparently he was super shy as a kid, like would literally hyperventilate before Hebrew school. But as an adult, he became known for this absolutely over-the-top energy.
I think I've seen some videos of him at Microsoft events.
Yes, those videos. They went viral before going viral was even really a thing. There's that famous one where he's literally jumping across the stage at Microsoft's 25th anniversary shouting, "I love this company," all sweaty and passionate. Or the developers video where he's chanting, "Developers, developers, developers," over and over while looking like he's about to explode from excitement.
That sounds intense.
Totally intense. But that's just who he was, right? He was known for shouting so much that he actually needed surgery on his vocal cords. Can you believe that? And it wasn't just for show. People who worked with him said that's genuinely how passionate he was about Microsoft and their products.
Did his personality affect how Microsoft operated as a company?
Absolutely. Ballmer brought this combative, high-energy culture to Microsoft. The company was known for these really intense internal debates that some people thought were personal arguments. But that was the Microsoft way under Ballmer. He wanted that passion and that commitment from everyone.
How did that go over with employees?
It was definitely polarizing. Some people thrived in that environment and, found it motivating. Others, not so much. But you can't deny that Ballmer was authentic. There was nothing manufactured about his enthusiasm. And in some ways, it helped Microsoft's public image because he was so different from the stereotypical, dry, technical CEO.
So different from Bill Gates?
Oh, totally different styles. Gates was much more cerebral and technical, while Ballmer was this force of nature. And I think that actually complemented each other well for many years. Gates had the technical vision, and Ballmer had the business drive and the ability to motivate people. That combination worked until it didn't.
Was his personality part of why he missed some of those big technological shifts we talked about?
That's a really good question. I think his forceful personality sometimes made it hard for people to challenge him or, push back on his views. When someone that passionate and that convinced tells you the iPhone will never succeed, it probably took a brave person to stand up and say, actually, I think you're wrong about this.
So, speaking of Bill Gates, I've always wondered about their relationship. I mean, they worked together for 30 years?
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. They had this incredibly close relationship. Like Ballmer was literally Gates's best man at his wedding to Melinda. And, people who knew them described their relationship as almost like a marriage. There was this mind meld between them for years and years.
That's pretty intense. Were they always on the same page?
Oh, God, no. And that's what made their relationship so interesting. They had these really combative debates that were just part of Microsoft's culture. But the thing is, what many outsiders saw as personal arguments was actually just how they worked together. They'd shout and disagree and push each other, but it was usually productive,
Did things change when Ballmer became CEO?
Absolutely. There was definitely tension during that transition of power. The Wall Street Journal reported this one incident where Gates actually stormed out of a meeting after this huge shouting match where Ballmer was defending some colleagues. And afterward, Ballmer apparently seemed really remorseful about it.
Wow, that sounds awkward.
Right? And there's this quote from Ballmer around that time where he said, "I'm not going to need him for anything. That's the principle. Use him, yes. Need him, no." Which is pretty revealing about how their relationship was evolving. Gates was still chairman and had the technological vision title as chief software architect, but Ballmer was really taking control.
So what happened after Ballmer left Microsoft?
Well, that's when things really fell apart. A few months after Ballmer resigned, Vanity Fair published this profile saying they literally weren't talking to each other anymore. There was real animosity between them over Ballmer's departure.
Did either of them ever talk about this publicly?
Yeah, in 2016, Ballmer gave an interview where he admitted they had drifted apart. He said they'd always had this brotherly relationship before, but the relationship broke down. And he specifically mentioned that his push into hardware, especially smartphones, which Gates didn't support, was a big factor in their falling out.
That's kind of sad, isn't it? After such a long partnership?
It really is. I mean, these guys were friends since college, built one of the world's most successful companies together, and then just stopped talking. It's like the business side of things eventually overwhelmed the personal relationship. And, when you think about how passionate and intense Ballmer is as a person, I can imagine those disagreements were pretty explosive.
Do you think they'll ever reconcile?
I don't know. I mean, it's been years now, and they're both such strong personalities with such strong opinions, but stranger things have happened, right? They shared so much history together. Maybe someday they'll find a way to, you know, reconnect as friends outside the Microsoft context.
So, after leaving Microsoft, Ballmer didn't just, like, retire to a beach somewhere, right? He went in a completely different direction.
Oh my God, absolutely. And it's like such a fascinating pivot. So Ballmer had actually been interested in sports ownership for years before he left Microsoft. Back in 2008, he was part of this local ownership group that tried to keep the Seattle Supersonics from leaving. They offered to invest $150 million toward renovating Key Arena, but that effort failed, and the team ended up moving to Oklahoma City, where they became the Thunder.
Ah, I remember hearing about that. Did he try again with Seattle?
He did. In 2012, he invested in this proposal to build a brand new arena in Seattle and bring the Supersonics back. Then in 2013, he and this guy, Chris Hansen, led a group trying to buy the Sacramento Kings for like $650 million and relocate them. But that fell through too.
So third time's the charm?
Exactly.